keep meaning to have it straightened, but never quite get around to it. And when I was invited to fish Judge John Volker's famous, and still secret, Frenchman's Pond in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, I brought a pretty old Wright and McGill Granger 8.5-foot 5-weight and got the chance to cast Volker's own Morris Kushner rod. I'm not normally intimidated by bamboo rods and usually preach that they're just fishing poles and should be treated as such, but the late Judge's heirloom rod scared me to death, and I couldn't wait to give it back to my host. In other words, I still do most of my fishing with split bamboo rods, often with a 4-piece graphite stashed in the truck as a spare. In over 40 years of fly fishing, I've broken surprisingly few rods, and only 2 of those were bamboo, and both were my fault. But I still make it a rule to bring a spare, so if I do break a rod, I can keep fishing instead of going home with my tail between my legs. For that matter, if a friend breaks a rod, it's easier to hand him your spare graphite rod than an old bamboo dripping with happy memories. Of course, it depends on the friend. I once lent Jim Babb a sweet old 7.5-foot F.E. Thomas Special that I thought he'd enjoy. He likes bamboo rods as much as I do, but he'd flown out to Colorado from his home in Maine with nothing but graphites for the same reason I might have. Not long after we separated on a small creek near home, he took a bad fall, bruised a bone in his leg, and barely managed to hobble back to the truck, where I eventually found him. After he told me the story, he added, "By the way, I managed not to break your rod." And I was secretly proud of myself for worrying about my friend and not even thinking about the rod. And I once loaned my 8-foot 4-weight Charlie Jenkins to Ed Engel, who was including Charlie in a book on bamboo craftsmen he was working on and wanted to fish one of his rods in the interest of journalistic accuracy. Ed took Jenkins to the South Platte River and proceeded to hook a very large rainbow. He said he thought about breaking the fish off to save the little 4-weight, then decided that if I'd been there I wouldn't have asked him to do that, so he went ahead and landed the fish. I guess I'd have done the same thing. For the most part, the bamboo rods I had when I wrote this book are the same ones I have now. With only a couple of exceptions, I haven't gotten any new ones or unloaded any old ones. I didn't realize it at the time, but I now think writing a book about bamboo rods puts a coda to several decades of chronic accumulating. Put simply, I already have more bamboo rods than any sane man needs. I'm embarrassed to say how many, including some that I think are as good as they get. Those would include an 8-foot 5-weight Hedden President, a 7.5-foot Maxwell-era Leonard 39DF, and an 8-foot 5-weight San Francisco Winston made by Lou Stoner that's a twin of the one on display at the Golden Gate Casting Club, except that theirs looks unfished and mine doesn't. One of the exceptions was a sweet 4-weight I got from Walter Babb, Jim Babb's older brother. Jim had told me that Walter was a fine rod maker, but I didn't think much of it, because what else would you say about your own brother? But then when we went down to East Tennessee to fish with Walter a few years ago, I asked to try out a couple of his rods, and they really were exceptional. I told him that, and then told myself that I didn't need and couldn't afford any more bamboo rods. I'd only been back home in Colorado for a few weeks when I broke down and called Walter at his home in Sweetwater. I asked if he could make me a 7-foot 9-inch 3-piece 4-weight. He said he thought he could add 3 inches to a 2-piece 7.5-foot Payne taper he liked and re-engineer it as a 3-piece. Long story short, I liked the rod so much, there are now a few local streams I won't fish with anything else. There was also the 9-foot 7-weight Payne I got in a trade with George, a retired doctor in his late 80s I used to correspond with. George and I exchanged long letters, on paper, with envelopes and stamps, about everything from bamboo fly rods to books to politics to the vicissitudes of getting older. And one day he asked if I had a Mike Clark rod I'd be willing to part with. A loaded question. George said he'd always wanted a Clark rod, but that Mike's waiting list was 5 years long, and he was afraid that at his age he might not.